Hello, welcome to Chapter 3 of Perception of Self. This is Communications 108, Communications and Social Interaction. So, what is perception? It is the process of using one's senses to understand and respond to stimuli. Of course, the five senses are visual, auditory or sound, taste, touch, and scent or smell. The important thing to keep in mind is what we perceive with our senses is our reality. And this becomes a very important part of communication because what we perceive is our reality. And when people try to say, no, that's not what I meant, they're trying to tell you that your perception or your reality is wrong. And that means that they're a bad communicator, not that you're a bad perceiver. Perception helps us gain information about the interpersonal communication skills of others, as well as yourself. As we perceive information, we begin to organize it. So we take it in, we put it in little understandable, manageable, organized chunks so that in our brain we're basically putting it into little boxes that make sense for us. And this affects the communication process through what we call selective perception, because you have all this stimuli coming at you all day long. And how do you manage it? Well, some of it becomes very important and it goes in the very important box. And other stuff goes in the we don't need to worry about it box. We're going to ignore it. How do we decide which box does it go in? Well, it's partly based on our goals and motivations. It's partly based on our biases and prejudice, and it's also partly based on what we are expecting, our expectations. Then we move on to the interpretation stage, which is assigning meaning to what one perceives. So if you look at the picture on the right, you might see the picture of a vase. But if you look closely at it, you'll also see the picture of two people looking at one another. This is interpretation. There is the overt or explicit interpretation, and then there's implicit or that subjective interpretation that may not be as obvious. And how we interpret things is influenced by a variety of factors, including our relationship history, the personal expectations that are involved, and the knowledge of ourselves and the other person or the other group. So there's a lot that goes into that interpretation. When you're having a conversation with a loved one or a spouse, how you interpret things is going to be a lot different than how you interpret a situation when you're having a conversation with a clerk in a store or a doctor or nurse in a hospital. Then we move on to the retrieval stage. And this is when we use what's called selective retention. This is how we recall information that agrees with one's perceptions while selectively forgetting information that does not. It is that way of being able to support our argument by utilizing information that supports our argument exclusively without utilizing any information that might undermine our argument. This little comic on the right-hand side, you'll see a bunny with very large ears, and his buddies in the background, the raccoon and the badger or beaver, are saying, yeah, but he only hears what he wants to hear. And I'm sure many of us have been accused of that. So we selectively retain and argue in a certain perspective based on how we perceive the information. So what exactly influences our perception? Well, as we discussed in the last PowerPoint, culture has a huge impact on the meaning we give to the perception of things that we experience. It impacts how we see the world, how we communicate with others, and how we receive communication from others. So if you look at this little comic here, we have a young woman, sunglasses, bikini, wedge heels, and she is saying, "Wow, everything is covered but her eyes. What a cruel male-dominated culture." On the right, there is a woman covered head to toe in a burqa with just her eyes showing, and she is saying, "Nothing covered but her eyes. What a cruel male-dominated culture." So it's all about perspective. One society sees that, exhibiting the female form for anyone to look at is, is very negative for women, and another culture may see that covering a woman from head to toe is negative for women. So it's all about your own cultural expectations. It doesn't mean it's wrong, doesn't mean it's right. It's just a cultural expectation. Other things that influence how you perceive the world include your sex and gender. So in terms of sex, or the biological makeup of an individual, and we're talking about, literally the biology of who we are as humans. In women, the part of the frontal lobe that is used for verbal fluency is larger than that of men's. And, there's that belief that women have a better ability to communicate in a more emotional way. Whereas in men, the part of the parietal cortex that is used for spatial perception is much larger than in women. And of course, men have always been much more dominant in the construction and engineering field. So, we're not necessarily discounting women in those fields, but biologically there are certain things, in addition to how different our genitals are, that are different in our brains. Now, in terms of gender, which are learned behaviors a culture associates with being male or female, and our socialization, which is the process by which men and women learn the gender roles appropriate to their sex, this affects how we see the world as well. There's this awesome study that was done in 2012 by Vanderbilt University psychologists. And basically what they did was they showed men and women pictures. And women, when they looked at the picture, were better at identifying the human beings or the living things first, whereas the men noticed the non-living or object recognition first. Now, they were using vehicles in the pictures, so maybe if they hadn't been using vehicles, it wouldn't have been so expedient in their recognition. But, the general thought process is that women are more human-oriented, men are more object-oriented. Then we have other physical factors. Our age, perception. When we're older, we tend to pay a little more attention to certain things. Our health, as we get older, we may not be able to see or hear as well. Our ability to taste diminishes. Our abilities to do things are not as good. Take a 12-year-old, tell them to run from here to the end of a 100-yard dash, no problem. Ask somebody in their 70s and they're going to look at you like you've lost their mind. Then we have technology, and this influences us in very overt and covert ways. People feel very connected and disconnected at the same time. There's dozens of stories of how, people can connect to thousands of friends online in a matter of seconds and yet feel so alone because they don't have any human contact. Whereas some older people who don't feel comfortable with the internet and with accessing the technology of the modern era feel like they've been left behind and they don't feel part of society anymore. Then there's this idea of our self-concept. And this is the relatively stable set of perceptions one holds of oneself. And we're going to talk about this in a lot more detail. So let's talk about, how do you perceive yourself, your self-concept? First, we have our self-awareness, the understanding of who you are. Then we have our self-worth. How do you feel about your talents, your knowledge, your abilities, your expertise, and your appearance? We've all had our great days where we look in the mirror and we go, wow, we look awesome today. And then we've also had those days where we feel worthless and useless and we're never going to make anything of ourselves and we might as well just slink off and find a cave to live in. A lot of this comes from not our own sense of self necessarily, but from what we call our self-esteem. And this is our opinion of ourselves, but this opinion is based on how others perceive us. We become a reflection of what others believe about us, as opposed to what we believe about ourselves. In other words, our self-esteem is a matter of how we've bought in to the opinions of what others think or say about us. So, for example, let's say that you're in school and you go out on recess and you have a schoolyard pick to see who's going to be on each other's teams to play soccer or kickball. You're the last one picked. The absolute worst feeling in the world, because your peers, your friends are telling you that nobody wants you to be on their team. It's the terrible feeling. So you begin to internalize that realization that you are in fact not an athlete. And this carries through the rest of your life. Whenever you're explicitly or implicitly given a message by people outside of your realm, you are taking that in as part of your self-esteem, those opinions. In high school, if someone calls you fat, or someone calls you pizza face, or any number of things that people say about you, you incorporate that into your self-concept, which lowers your self-esteem. And it's a really hard thing to overcome, and oftentimes people will spend the rest of their lives dealing with a very challenging sense of self-esteem. This negative self-perception is something that a lot of us carry around because, unfortunately, most of us tend to buy in to negative comments much more easily than positive comments. It's way easier to believe that somebody thinks we're stupid than somebody thinks we're really smart. When somebody compliments us, we always wonder in the back of our mind, what do they want from us? Is there a reason they're complimenting us? So consequently, many people develop this negative self-perception, which then manifests itself as a sense of shame about who we are. And this sense of shame becomes a very important element in dealing with ourselves, especially as young people, from adolescence all the way through our 20s and often into our 30s and 40s. Shame can lead to many issues, and some of the more prevalent issues that a lot of us have dealt with include eating disorders such as anorexia, which is the desire to literally disappear because people feel so badly about themselves. Narcissism, which is the desire to be noticed and validated. They talk about themselves so much because they're dying for somebody to give them some attention. Then you have your, addicts who, they just don't go to rehab and get better, but who constantly go to rehab, fall off the wagon, engage in really terrible behavior, and then end up back in rehab. And this is a cycle they go through over and over and over again. That recidivism. This is a cycle of self-destruction and self-medicating their pain. These people are filled with so much shame, they're trying to destroy themselves. And when they don't manage to destroy themselves, they go through that self-medication to deal with their shame. On the other side of the coin, you also have people who are overachievers. They're insanely neurotic overachievers. And we may think they're type A individuals who, just need to be straight A students, but they're also trying to prove that they're good enough to be loved. And that if just somebody out there noticed how hard they work and how good they are, somebody might love them. And I know this sounds so sad, but, shame leads to a lot of this stuff. And it's because we have bought into all of the negative self-perception that people have fed us with negative comments through our youth, especially adolescence, and we have bought in. So, really the first part of rejecting this stuff is to realize that we're not who these people say we are. We are, in fact, good people who can change and become healthy people who can see the world for what it is. Another element of perception is called self-fulfilling prophecy. This is also called the Pygmalion Effect, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But the basic definition of a self-fulfilling prophecy is the prediction or expectation about one's future behavior that is likely to come true because one believes in it. So it acts in a way that makes it happen. A self-imposed self-fulfilling prophecy occurs when one's own expectations influences his or her behaviors. You believe you can work out, get in shape, and get into the Olympics, so you make it happen. Other imposed occurs when expectations of another person influences an individual's behavior. So somebody else believes that you are so smart, you will be able to get a scholarship. And they believe in you so much that you begin to believe in yourself. Now, these are positive examples. There are also, unfortunately, negative examples. So if you have a parent who's not very nice and they call you stupid and dummy and that you'll never amount to much, you start to believe that. So you act out in school and the teachers begin to categorize you as a troublemaker. And because you believe you're a troublemaker, you continue to act as a troublemaker, and so on and so forth. So you don't accomplish anything. So now, why is it called the Pygmalion Effect? Well, the long story, which I will make very short, is that there was a play written over 100 years ago, give or take, by George Bernard Shaw called The Pygmalion. And it's about a professor who takes on a young girl who is completely illiterate and ignorant, and makes a bet with another professor that he can teach her how to be a lady and pass her off at a royal ball, essentially, and essentially he wins, of course, and passes off this young lady as a princess kind of thing. Anyway, it was remade as a movie, My Fair Lady. Great movie. Go watch it. But anyway, so these researchers from Harvard, Robert Rosenthal and Jacobson, gave an intelligence test to all of the students at elementary school at the beginning of the school year in the 1960s. Then they randomly selected 20% of the students without any relation to their test results. They didn't even look at the test results, and reported to the teachers that these 20% of average students were showing an unusual potential for intellectual growth and could be expected to bloom in their academic performance by the end of the year. So randomly, they picked 20% of the kids and said these kids are going to be phenomenal by the end of the year. So 8 months later, they retested all of the students, and what they discovered was those who had been labeled as intelligent showed a significantly greater increase in their results than the other children who were not singled out for the teacher's attention. What this means is that the teacher's expectations regarding the intellectual performance of these special kids led to the actual change in intellectual performance of these randomly selected children. In other words, because the teachers were told that these students were academically above average, the teachers treated the students as if they were academically above average, which led to the students performing academically above average. So in other words, the self-fulfilling prophecy in full color right there. So now let's talk about identity management. It explains how individuals handle oneself in various circumstances. People are said to behave according to their goals. A person's competency and identity work together in his or her interactions with others. So you have to ask yourself, how do you want to be seen by your friends, your peers in school, your coworkers? What values define your life? How would someone describe you? So the question really becomes, how do you want to be seen or perceived by the people in your world? Now keep in mind, the person you are at work, the person you are at home, and the person you are with your friends does not have to be the exact same person. You can be goofy and silly with your friends. You can be professional and responsible at work. And you can be loving and supportive at home. You don't have to be one characteristic. And this is really the key to managing who you are, because we all have so many different facets to our personality. It's a matter of managing all of those facets. The value of self-knowledge stems from the fact that the self represents the only constant throughout your life. Everything in our life will change. Who we are does not. We may change parts of who our personality, how we laugh, how we see the world, but who we are as ourselves really doesn't change. So if we can define who we are, what is important to us, our values, it can provide a really solid base to manage our decisions. If we don't have a clear self-knowledge, we can be paralyzed by the need to make daily decisions. If you're a person who has a really hard time making daily decisions, that means you don't have a clear sense of what your values and attitudes and preferences are. And this is where you have to start thinking, what is important to me as a person? What is my value system? What are my ethical framework for making good choices? So here is this other concept that is really also very important to understand, because pretty much most of us experience cognitive dissonance on a regular basis. And this occurs when a person holds two inconsistent or conflicting beliefs or attitudes about oneself or a situation, or when there is a discrepancy between beliefs and behaviors. So, for example, an environmentalist who drives a Hummer, a peace activist who plans a murder, or a doctor who smokes cigarettes. Cognitive dissonance, as you see with the little cartoon there on the right, the young lady is saying, liars are bad people, but I just lied. We all have these moments where we understand from a personal moral perspective that lying is bad. But most of us, on a pretty regular basis, might throw a white lie out once in a while, or on a daily basis even. Honey, does my butt look big in these pants? Oh no, you look great, baby. We've all done that. We've all been there. The theory, though, is that dissonance, being unpleasant, we don't like feeling that we're not being a good person, motivates us to change our cognition, our attitude, or our behavior. Another element of perception is something that the book calls facework. Face is the image of the self you choose to present to others in your interpersonal encounters. And I like to think of this as that moment when you're 13 or 14 and your parents are yelling at you or having a serious conversation. Now, on the one hand, you can have the positive face, and you're going to be open to whatever they're saying. You're going to smile. You're going to be confirming what they're saying. You're respecting your parents. You value what they're saying. On the other hand, a lot of us really know how to put on the negative face. We are trying to reject them from imposing their will on us. We are disrespecting them because they're not respecting our unique individuality. And we are rejecting their interference in our actions or beliefs. And then, take that and explore that into all aspects of our life. How we present our face tells the person who is interacting with us everything about our attitude. Most of us do not have a very good poker face, and as such, we have to be very aware that how we interact with others is written all over our face. So we have to practice that in a situation where we may be discussing something that is not a positive experience. We have to refrain from pouting, sulking, any of those negatives that we may have been accused of by our mom and dad. Improving identity management allows you to control how others perceive you. And this includes understanding appropriate behavior is defined by time and place. If you want to go out and blow off some steam, do some tequila shots, party, sing some songs at the top of your lungs, doing it in the break room at work is probably neither the time nor the place. You need to focus on the present moment. And you need to practice self-monitoring. You need to actively think about and control your behavior and your actions. One of the best pieces of advice that I was ever given was when you get angry at somebody and you lose your temper, you are giving them the control that they seek over you because you've given up your sense of power. You've lost it. You've lost your temper and you gave it to them. And, the reality is When you lose your temper at home with your family, with your love muffin, with your kids, that's different because you love them. But if it is someone at work, if it's a taxi driver, if it's your Uber driver, if it is somebody at school, you are literally giving somebody your power because you can't control yourself. So, really practice self-monitoring. And more importantly, develop a professional identity that you are comfortable with. Another major aspect is your online identity management. And I know everybody complains that, you have to be careful and you have to, everybody's warned you about doing whatever you're doing online. But you have to manage your identity these days, not just for personal reasons, but also, more importantly, professional reasons. And essentially, this is what you want to do. Anything that could damage you professionally should be done using a nickname or anonymously, a pseudonym. I like to call this the grandma test. If you wouldn't want your grandma to see it, use a pseudonym or a nickname. Anything that could endanger you personally should be eliminated from your activities. Nobody wants to see you on the news because you were on Craigslist trolling for some kind of kinky sex and now you've been found at the bottom of a lake. So, just say no, as they used to say in the old days. Now, email addresses. This is literally some of the email addresses I have seen over the past 20 years from students, and some are more obvious than others. Obviously, the first two are pretty much, don't use those. The third one, jsmith69, yep, even old people know what that means. The fourth one, Mary Smith 1955. The problem with that one, you're aging yourself. People don't necessarily want to hire somebody who's almost 60 or is over 60. The next one, Jamal T, 1997. Nobody wants to hire someone who's 18 either, necessarily, unless it's McDonald's or Chipotle. I hate gays. If you are discriminating against any group, that is wrong. Last two, also pretty much self-explanatory. If you're going to have an email that you're using for professional reasons, and we'll talk about this in a lot more detail when we get into professional communication, you want to make sure that email is professional. It doesn't say what your religion is. It doesn't say how old you are. It doesn't imply any kind of political affiliation. Sarah Palin forever should not be your particular email address. So, we'll go into that in more detail, but just putting it out there. So, next we're moving into the wonderful world of attribution theory. And for those of you who may have studied sociology, this should be vaguely familiar. This is how we make conclusions about others' personalities. Research has shown that a person's perceptions are distorted based on whether that person is an in-group member or an out-group member. So, for example, if you are an African American Baptist and you meet somebody who is also an African American who belongs to a Baptist church, your perception of them is going to automatically be more positive. Now, let's say instead you are an Asian Catholic. Well, your perception of an African Baptist is not necessarily going to be negative, but it's not going to be as positive as somebody who's from the same group that you belong to. When we assess a person's behavior, we have to determine if what we observe or what we perceive is based on our own biases. Attitudes about a specific behavior can also be impacted by the in-group and out-group phenomena. So, we can talk about race, we can talk about religion, but one of the most specific in-group versus out-group phenomenon is gender, male and female. So in a business setting, a man who is aggressive and ambitious is often seen in a very positive light by the other men in his company. So somebody like Steve Jobs, who was admittedly a jerk by pretty much everyone, but was deeply admired by a huge swath of people in the IT industry, could be compared to somebody like Hillary Clinton, who is also very ambitious and very aggressive or assertive. But if you ask a lot of people how they would describe her, they see her as pushy, or, the infamous B word, bitch. And the reality is that, there's been thousands of male politicians who are equally aggressive and ambitious, but nobody calls them that kind of a name. This is where attribution and attitude come into play. We as a society have to recognize these perceptions and fight against them. There's nothing wrong with having a woman who is pushy or, more importantly, assertive and ambitious. We also have something called attribution errors, and these are errors made in attributing causes for people's behavior based on their membership in a particular group. We tend to see people in our in-group positively and people in the out-group negatively. So, for example, a non-tattooed person assumes all people with tattoos are sleazy. A man assumes that all women are bad drivers. A Hispanic person assumes all white people are prejudiced. A French person assumes all Americans are loud and obnoxious. Ironically, ask an American and many of them will say all French people are loud and obnoxious. And you could go on and on and on with this. So, attribution errors are very, very common, and you should always ask yourself, is this perception you're making an attribution error? Just because one person with a tattoo is a bad person doesn't mean all people with tattoos are bad people. So, let's talk about how we manage our impressions. We want to create a strategy to influence another person's perceptions. Sometimes it's unconscious, sometimes it's conscious. Other people are doing this as well. And we want to be aware that people are trying to manage how you are seeing them and how they are seeing you. So what we want to do is understand that they're manipulating us to see them in a very particular way. It's usually very harmless, but sometimes people want to scam you. You see a guy, he's wearing a $2,000 suit, he's got beautiful Italian-made shoes, handmade, he's got a tie on that's beautiful silk, he's got the gold cufflinks, he's got the Rolex watch, and he has a deal for you. He is selling oil wells in Madagascar. You're like, God, how could I refuse? The guy is totally legit. Look how awesome he looks. Well, again, just because a person looks a particular way doesn't necessarily mean he's going to be honest. So remember, not everyone uses their impression management for good. Sometimes they use their powers for evil. So how do you improve your self-concept? First, you have to have the desire and the will to change. Then you have to decide what you'd like to change. Set reasonable personal goals. Don't suddenly decide that you're going to have some bizarre goal, that you're going to live on the planet Neptune. You're going to move to another alternate universe. Those are ridiculous goals because it's not feasible. You want to set reasonable personal goals. Review and revise those goals on a regular basis. Surround yourself with people who you support and who trust you as you improve your self-confidence and your self-concept. Most importantly, develop resiliency. This skill allows people to recognize mistakes, learn from them, and bounce back from disappointment. Resiliency is the one skill that will help you throughout your entire life be a better person. Now, what are the elements of resiliency? I'm glad you asked. So, there are 4 aspects. Physical. You need to have stamina. Being resilient isn't something you can just wake up and do. You have to build up your stamina. You have to lead a healthy life. And you have to get sleep. Because if you don't have energy, if you don't have the ability to rest, and if you don't have stamina, you're not going to be resilient. You have to have a strong mental outlook. You have to believe in yourself. You have to develop confidence. You have to have a positive outlook. You have to avoid getting stuck in those negative thinking traps. You have to focus on your goal. You have to ask yourself why you failed at a particular issue. And you have to try and control what you can control. Within the emotional dimension, you have to try and maintain calm and learn how to control your anger. Learn how to control your sadness. You have to control your impulses. We all once in a while want to take all the money we have and blow it on a night out. But we have to then ask ourselves, what is the long-term consequence? We have to be realistic with our optimism. We have to be positive. These are all emotional skill sets that will help us bounce back when we have a bad circumstance. Finally, a spiritual dimension. This doesn't necessarily mean you got to go out, get baptized, believe in God or Allah. You have to have a sense of values. There has to be something that you use as a barometer in your life to believe in something. You have to be empathetic to others. You have to reach out. You have to want to help others. The more you help others, others will then want to help you. These dimensions of resilience will ultimately build for you a better self-concept that ultimately will make you a happier, more successful person. So that's it for today's chapter. If you have any questions, please email or text me. And I hope you have a terrific day. Thank you.